Hello and welcome to Obviouscasts episode 3. In this episode, we are going to be doing a beginning of a new series called the Deep Dive, and we are going to be talking about descriptors. So, descriptors. One of the core parts of Obvious is a tool that we call descriptors. And what descriptors are is basically a tool for you to, when you're designing the beginnings of your project, you want to be able to sketch out your use cases. And it seems to me that the best systems are not designed just around structure and the sort of infrastructure that you're going to need, but rather they're designed around real user needs and real user use cases. So in designing Obvious, we said, okay, when you are creating a new action, an action is basically a use case in code. So when you're designing a system, you really need to design it from the standpoint of what does the system need to be able to do? And you really want to think about what are the requirements of what the system needs to be able to do for the users. And so that's why we start from the standpoint of use cases. And so what descriptors are is descriptors are basically an attempt to put some of the required information of what you think an action might do into a descriptor file. And I'll show you how that works. Why do we care about use cases? Well, ultimately, at the end of the day, your users are using your system, and you might be the user, you might be the one writing code against the system. But what you need to think about is what kind of activities does the system needs to do, and those should be driven by the requirements of what sort of functionality and what sort of constraints do you have on the system. And when you understand what the requirements are, then you can design the use cases. And so ultimately, if we are designing for use cases, we are designing for how the system's actually going to be used and needed to be used in the everyday world, then we will provide a better system for our users. And ultimately, we will be writing better software and hopefully even less software, because if we write just what the users need, then we're not writing a bunch of extra stuff just because we can. So it should save you time, it should save you money, and ultimately you should have a better product as a result. So, descriptors describe use cases. They are a YAML file, and the best way I would describe them is they are a sketch. And so, a lot of times when I'm designing systems or when I'm thinking about software, I start with just a pen or pencil and paper, and I start thinking about what does this system need to do? What are the core functionalities? What are the requirements? What problems am I solving? And so, what I start by doing is I will start by just listing out all the actions that the system will need to perform. And I don't just say uh, create user, user login. I mean, I'll try and use language that matches the system, that matches the use case. So, for example, you might have a create subscription or subscribe to something action. You might, think in terms of your problem domain instead of thinking in terms of these really sort of high level things that you might end up with as far as controllers or whatever else. So, thinking in terms of what the system does and sort of sketching that out early is a really useful design tool. Uh, Also, as I start to think about what kind of actions a system might have, I also start thinking about the dependencies. Because obviously, if you have, say, creating a user, that user has, or that action has a sort of implicit dependency on like a user entity. For example, it might have other dependencies as well, maybe a profile, I don't know. But the point is that when you are sketching out early these sort of high level concepts of what the functionality is, you can also use it as an opportunity to think about where these actions touch other things. And so, as part of the descriptors, you can actually sketch out some of the required dependencies, required functionality that you think you might need. So, also, when building sort of use case first, what inevitably happens is you start needing to generate an action, and then you'll need to generate an entity, and you'll need to generate your contracts, because these are the building blocks, the fundamentals of Obvious. And so when you create one action and you start looking at its dependencies, you can very quickly say, oh, I need to add this file for the action, and I need to add a test file for it. I need to add the entity, and you add a test for that, and so on and so forth. And so as I built these out manually the first time, I realized that a lot of this stuff can be generated from these descriptor files. And so the descriptor files became a code generation tool, but they're also a test generation tool. And the benefit of that is that when you start a system, if you start by writing out a bunch of descriptor files, then what you end up with is a set of the structure and pending tests that your project will have. And so Obvious doesn't write all your code for you, but it takes the things in the descriptor file and turns them into comments. So you're basically giving a high level description of what you think it might need to do, and then it's just going to basically copy those things over as comments so that when you actually start writing the code, you have your best guess in a comment. Now, you probably want to delete those comments and actually write real code, but the point is that you have a real working structure that is already set up for you. But also, the descriptors are a guess, and it's important to be clear about this, that since they are a guess, they are not an ongoing living documentation of your system. They are an early rough sketch. The ongoing living documentation of your system is likely going to be your test suite. It's likely going to be other forms of documentation. It's also possibly the code itself. And so you don't want to just keep going back to the descriptors over and over again. You want to write them once and use that as a jumping off point to save yourself a bunch of time. So here's an example of a descriptor, and this comes out of the Obvious Status project that is just the example app for Obvious right now. So right here, oops, we have the create status action. And the descriptor file is a YAML file, so it's very human readable. The action at a high level, it's looking for three things: an action, a description, and some code. So our action here is create status. Our description is should create a status update, and you have code. So the code, the C stands for comment. So each of these represents a comment that's going to be in your action code. And so we're going to validate, we think that on a create status, we should validate the input, set default and ID values for a new status entity, populate it, save the status to the jack, and return the result. Very simple, very high level. But there's also the option to say requires. So populating a status object, we're going to say would require status.populate. So a couple naming conventions here. Status, anything that has the word jack in it implies a jack with a contract. So statusjack.save will stub you out a contract for the status jack. So a status jack contract. Anything that doesn't have the word jack in it is going to be assumed to be an entity. So status is an entity, status jack is for a contract. So this code will then generate not only your create status action, but it will also generate your status entity, and it will also generate your status jack contract. And it just does it in a very high level way so that you still end up writing the code yourself. You still have to define these things, but it creates the stubbed out structure for you, and it creates some test guesses of what we think you might need to have in these cases. What does the generated code look like for the action itself? The generated code here, this is the high level of the create status action. It requires your status entity, which it creates for you. It requires or it creates your initializer, and this just is the dependency injection part of Obvious. So it just sets that up for you. And then it also creates the execute method, and that is on the next slide. So here you can see the execute method is really simple. It doesn't do anything. There's no code in here. It's just comments. But the comments transfer directly over. So you would maybe put in code to validate the input. You'd put in the code here to do that. And then you're telling yourself that, oh, you might need to call status.populate. Now you might not. This is again just a guess. When you actually get to implementing this, what you end up using might change. But at a high level, these things are the rough estimates of what the flow should look like. And then here is a generated test for that action. And again, you notice that it just generates some pending tests. Uh, we aren't going to write your tests for you. We're not going to guess at what you think they should do. We're just going to tell you the things that we think you might want to test for. And the sort of cool side effect is that when you have a bunch of these descriptors in place, you can run them, and all of a sudden you can see here we have pending tests, 40 examples, 0 failures, 0 pending. And this is just off of a generation running obvious generate on the status app. And so when you build your app based off these descriptors, you have all these pending tests. So as you fill out the tests and you fill out your code, when you get to the point where you have no more pending tests, you know that you've built that initial concept of what the system is. Now, your system's probably not done, but you at least know that you've built that much of it. And so, if you're building a sort of V1 and you have this sort of initial set of requirements that you need to build towards an initial set of functionality, you can write all the descriptors for that, write the actual code, and then when you actually have no more pending tests, you probably are pretty close, if not actually completed, with that initial set of required functionality. Now, notice that you still have to write the code, and I feel like I can't stress this enough that they're a design tool. They're meant to save you time in building out the structure, but the descriptors are never intended and should never be attempted to generate your code for you, for the simple fact that we don't want to guess at what your entities look like. You don't want to get too specific. You want to spend your time writing actual code. You don't want to spend time describing the code that you'd like to write and coming up with these big formalized languages and dependency tree things. You just want to be able to have a quick way to sketch out the system and then get into real code, because real code is where you can deliver real value. So a couple things to know. You can run obvious generate more than once. It's designed to be non-destructive, so it will, if you run obvious generate in your folder, it'll generate app, and then it'll generate, I think, app_1, app_2, etc. each time, so that it's not going to destroy your existing app and the existing progress that you've made. So you can do some interesting things with that down the road, but the general idea is just that, like, we don't want to blow away any existing code. We don't want to have any accidents. So run it as many times as you want, and that's fine. Bad syntax will cause broken tests. If you define something incorrectly in places, it will potentially break your tests. So we can't guess at every syntax that's correct or not correct. So we're just going to, if your test, like, it's just generating your code for you, so it's not perfect. Once you have your initial set of descriptors, don't go back and maintain them, because as your requirements might change or as you have more information, it is really silly to go back and try and maintain these descriptors. Instead, you should write real tests and real code, and I pretty much just use them when I start, and then I don't always delete them, but I don't really ever look back at them either. One thing that we're thinking about, and if anyone has good ideas on, is incremental code generation. You could kind of do this now if you wanted to add a new descriptor and run the description again. Again, obvious generate is not destructive, so you could do that and then copy files over. At that point, I'm not sure how much time it's saving you, but in a sort of ideal world, we'd like to be able to add a new description of an action and then have that sort of fold into the existing code base. So we're working on that, but I don't know if that's coming anytime soon. Uh, so don't be afraid to throw them all away if you want to, if that makes it easier, so that you're not tempted to go back and maintain them, because these are not a ongoing useful tool. They're really useful at the beginning. They're really useful when you want to generate a bunch of structure and you don't want to have to deal with writing all those files yourself. But they are not a sort of ongoing maintenance tool. And most importantly, descriptors are not required at all. They're totally optional, and you don't need to use them to use Obvious. The whole point is just to save you some time. But when I started Obvious, I just used plain old touching files and writing it all by hand. And it's not hard to do it that way, but it is a little just it's just more manual labor. And this is a labor saving device. So you can use them, you cannot use them, but ultimately they are a design tool to sketch out a project and to try and save you some time to get to the right structure. So that is what you need to know about descriptors. I hope you liked it, and that ends episode 3 of Obviouscasts. Hope to see you back here again next time. Have a great day.